Imagine standing beside a quiet harbor before sunrise, when the sea is still dark and the lamps along the quay have begun to fade. Ropes creak against wooden posts, sailors speak in low voices, and somewhere aboard an anchored vessel, a clerk presses a seal into warm wax. There are soldiers here, along with horses, armor, shields, and enough provisions for a difficult journey. Yet the object that will matter most is not a sword. It is a folded document, carried carefully between rulers who may never sit together in the same room. How could a crusade recover Jerusalem without storming its walls? And how could a Christian emperor achieve that result while formally cast outside the church? The answer begins not in Jerusalem itself, but among the flooded fields of Egypt, where an earlier expedition had discovered how quickly confidence could sink into mud. Before we follow that road, allow the room around you to become a little quieter. Let your shoulders rest, soften your jaw, and allow your hands to settle wherever they feel comfortable. You do not need to remember every ruler, treaty, or disputed claim. Medieval politics was tangled even for the people living through it, and the story will remain meaningful if some names simply pass by like distant lights along a shoreline. If calm journeys through history are something you enjoy, you may choose to subscribe, but only if this feels like a place you would genuinely like to visit again. At this hour, other listeners may be settling beneath blankets in cities, villages, and quiet rooms far from your own. For the next little while, we will travel together toward the Eastern Mediterranean, where a crusade unlike any before it was slowly taking shape. In 1221, the Fifth Crusade ended in failure beside the Nile. Its leaders had believed that Egypt was the strategic key to Jerusalem, reasoning that if they could seize the rich cities of the Nile Delta, they might exchange them for the Holy City or use it as dips as a base for further conquest. The Crusaders captured Damietta in 1219, but their success encouraged them to push inland, even as the river rose and Muslim forces controlled the surrounding land. Sultan al-Kamil, the Ayyubid ruler of Egypt and a nephew of Saladin, offered terms that reportedly included the return of Jerusalem. The Crusader leadership refused, partly because some believed a greater military victory remained within reach. Instead, their army became trapped by floodwater, failing supplies, and carefully directed Ayyubid pressure. Damietta was surrendered, the survivors withdrew, and Jerusalem remained beyond Crusader control. Yet the failure left behind something more subtle than disappointment. It demonstrated that Jerusalem might be recovered through bargaining, because al-Kamil had already shown that he regarded territory as part of a wider political calculation. To many Western Christians, the city was the spiritual center of the crusading movement, a place whose churches and remembered landscapes possessed immeasurable sacred value. To the Ayyubid rulers, Jerusalem was also holy, but it was only one element within a broad and frequently divided political world stretching across Egypt and Syria. Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, trade routes, fortresses, family alliances, and access to agricultural revenue could all matter more urgently at a particular moment. That difference did not make either side less religious. It meant that devotion existed beside government, taxation, inheritance, military supply, and dynastic rivalry. A city could be sacred and still become part of a negotiation. Far across the Mediterranean, the man expected to lead the next expedition was already famous for making promises and delaying their fulfillment. Frederick II ruled the Kingdom of Sicily and held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, placing him at the center of a complicated network of German princes, Italian cities, bishops, nobles, and royal officials. Raised in Sicily, he governed a realm shaped by Latin Christian, Greek, Jewish, and Islamic traditions. Arabic learning remained visible in parts of his court, while scholars, physicians, translators, administrators, and poets moved through a kingdom connected to several cultural worlds. Later admirers sometimes presented Frederick as a uniquely modern ruler, while hostile contemporaries described him as dangerous, arrogant, or insufficiently obedient. Neither image fully captures him. He was intelligent, curious, calculating, often severe, and deeply protective of royal authority. Frederick had taken a crusading vow years earlier, but European politics repeatedly delayed his departure. Every postponement increased suspicion. Popes feared that his authority in Sicily and northern Italy might surround the Papal States, while Frederick resented attempts to place imperial policy under papal direction. The crusade, therefore, became more than an expedition overseas. It became a test of who could command Christian rulers, define legitimate leadership, and claim credit for Jerusalem if the city were recovered. Pope Honorius III had treated Frederick with a measure of patience, continuing to negotiate schedules and preparations. After Honorius died in 1227, however, Pope Gregory IX inherited both the unfinished crusade and a deep distrust of the emperor. Marriage drew Frederick even more closely into the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. In 1225, he married Isabella II, also known as Yolande, the young Queen of Jerusalem. Through her, Frederick claimed the royal title associated with the Crusader kingdom, although this claim soon created tension with Isabella's father, John of Brienne, who had previously governed as king. Frederick's interest in the Holy Land was therefore spiritual, dynastic, and political at the same time. Recovering Jerusalem could fulfill his vow, strengthen his prestige, and confirm his position within the kingdom. Yet in the ports where ships were being prepared, such ambitions looked less majestic. Carpenters repaired hulls, handlers loaded fodder, merchants counted grain, and sailors checked barrels for leaks. Great plans always depended upon small tasks being completed before the tide changed. In the summer of 1227, troops and pilgrims gathered in southern Italy. The heat was oppressive, the camps crowded, and disease began spreading among those waiting to depart. Frederick finally sailed in September, accompanied by Louis IV, Landgrave of Thuringia, but illness soon overcame many aboard the fleet. Louis died, and Frederick himself became sick enough to turn back after only a few days. Whether Gregory IX believed the illness was genuine mattered less than the long history of delays that preceded it. To the Pope, the Emperor had once again failed to honor a sacred commitment. On September 29, 1227, Gregory excommunicated Frederick, formally excluding him from the Church's sacraments and placing an immense shadow over any expedition he might still attempt. The contradiction was extraordinary. Crusades were proclaimed and spiritually authorized by the papacy, yet the man preparing to lead this one had been condemned by the Pope. Some crusaders feared that following him would place their own spiritual standing at risk. Church officials hesitated to cooperate, while the military orders would later maintain a guarded distance from his command. Frederick protested, insisting that illness had forced his return, and that he remained committed to the journey. He did not abandon the expedition. Instead, he prepared to sail again while still excommunicated, turning the crusade into a direct challenge to Gregory's authority. During these preparations, Frederick's personal claim to Jerusalem changed again. Isabella II died in 1228 after giving birth to their son, Conrad. The infant became the lawful king of Jerusalem, while Frederick asserted authority as his regent. What had begun as a claim through marriage now depended upon the rights of a child who could neither speak for himself nor understand the distant city attached to his name. In palaces, lawyers and nobles argued over titles. In workshops, leather was stitched, metal fittings were repaired, and parchment orders moved from desk to desk. The kingdom that Frederick hoped to command existed partly in stone walls and coastal towns, but also in seals, bloodlines, oaths, and interpretations of law. On June 28, 1228, Frederick finally departed from Brindisi with a force far smaller than the great host imagined years before. He did not possess enough men for a confident invasion of Egypt or a prolonged siege of Jerusalem. His enemies in Italy remained active, the Pope remained hostile, and many leaders in the Crusader states were uncertain whether to obey him. By ordinary standards, the expedition seemed weakened before it had properly begun. Yet Frederick carried something armies often lacked: an existing diplomatic connection with al-Kamil and an awareness that the Ayyubid world was divided by its own family struggles. As the ships moved east, sails tightening beneath the Mediterranean wind, the Crusade's true character was still hidden. Soldiers may have imagined walls, marches, and battle lines, but the decisive movement would take place through envoys traveling between guarded camps. Jerusalem would be discussed as a sacred inheritance, a military burden, a symbol of legitimacy, and a temporary answer to several political problems. The emperor was sailing toward the Holy Land without papal blessing and without the strength to conquer his objective by force. But far ahead of him, Sultan al-Kamil also had reasons to avoid another war, and between these two complicated rulers, a narrow path toward Jerusalem was beginning to open. Part 2. The war conducted through messengers. Before reaching the mainland, Frederick's fleet paused at Cyprus, an island that had become one of the most important Christian bases in the eastern Mediterranean. There he was drawn into a dispute with John of Ibelin, the powerful lord of Beirut and one of the leading nobles of the Crusader East. Frederick demanded control over royal revenues and challenged the authority that the Ibelin family exercised during the minority of the young Cypriot king, Henry I. The argument took place beneath the formal courtesies of a banquet, but neither side misunderstood what was at stake. Frederick believed that imperial rank and legal claims entitled him to obedience. The local nobility believed that their own customs could not simply be set aside by a ruler arriving from Europe. No open war began that evening, yet the distrust created in Cyprus followed the emperor toward the coast of Palestine. Even before negotiating with the Muslim Sultan, Frederick had shown how difficult it would be to command the Christians, whose cause he claimed to represent. On September 7, 1228, the emperor arrived at Acre, the crowded coastal capital of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. From the harbor, the city appeared strong. Stone walls, defensive towers, church roofs, warehouses, and ships gathered behind the protection of the bay. Inside, however, authority was divided among royal officers, local barons, Italian merchants, church leaders, and the military orders. The Teutonic Knights were generally more sympathetic to Frederick, especially under their master, Hermann von Salza, who had long tried to mediate between emperor and pope. The Templars and Hospitallers were far more cautious. Because Frederick remained excommunicated, they could not comfortably place themselves beneath his direct command. Patriarch Gerald of Jerusalem regarded him with open suspicion, and many local nobles wondered whether he had come to protect their kingdom or to impose his own distant government upon it. The result was an army that could march together, but could not fully agree on who was leading it. Orders had to be phrased carefully, sometimes issued in the name of the kingdom, rather than personally by the emperor. Clergy could not simply celebrate Frederick, as the sacred commander of a papally approved expedition. Soldiers watched banners rise over separate camps, while messengers carried instructions between men who occupied the same coastline, yet belonged to competing structures of loyalty. The emperor still possessed prestige, experienced retainers, money, and a formidable reputation, but his military force was too small to capture Jerusalem by siege. More reinforcements were expected from Europe, though Frederick knew that time was working against him. News from Italy suggested that Pope Gregory IX was preparing to attack his territories while he remained overseas. Every week spent in Palestine made his position at home more dangerous. Yet the Muslim world facing Frederick was divided as well. Sultan al-Kamil ruled Egypt, but the Ayyubid dynasty was not a single centralized state, moving under one unquestioned will. Saladin's relatives had inherited territories across Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and Upper Mesopotamia, creating a family network in which cooperation and rivalry existed side by side. Al-Kamil had earlier sought Frederick's arrival, partly because he feared his brother al-Mu'azzam, the ruler of Damascus, whose alliance with Khwarezmian forces threatened the balance of power. In that earlier moment, offering Jerusalem may have seemed a reasonable price for Western military pressure against Damascus. But circumstances changed before Frederick landed. Al-Mu'azzam died in November 1227, leaving his young son al-Nasir Dawood in a vulnerable position. The immediate threat that had encouraged al-Kamil to seek imperial assistance had faded, and the Sultan no longer needed Frederick in quite the same way. This change placed both rulers in an uncomfortable position. Frederick had crossed the sea expecting al-Kamil to honor promises made during an earlier political crisis. Al-Kamil now controlled Jerusalem and had less reason to surrender it, but withdrawing completely from his earlier understanding could provoke the emperor into war at the very moment when Ayyubid family negotiations remained unsettled. Neither ruler wanted a major campaign. Frederick lacked the army for one, while al-Kamil wished to concentrate on Damascus and the redistribution of his family's territories. Their interests did not produce friendship, and they never met face to face. Instead, they created a narrow space in which diplomacy might succeed because battle was inconvenient for them both. Soon after reaching Acre, Frederick sent envoys to al-Kamil's camp at Nablus. Among them were Thomas of Aquino and Balian of Sidon, men capable of moving between courts where every gesture could carry political meaning. They brought gifts and formal messages, then returned with answers and presents from the Sultan. Al-Kamil's principal representative was the Emir Fakhr al-Din, an experienced diplomat who had already visited Frederick's court. The emperor could communicate in Arabic to some degree, an unusual ability among Western rulers, and he displayed a serious interest in the intellectual life of the Islamic world. Questions concerning mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and geometry traveled alongside discussions of fortresses, roads, villages, and sacred places. Scholars were consulted, curiosities exchanged, and entertainments arranged. Behind these cultivated gestures, however, remained the difficult question that had drawn the emperor east. Would Jerusalem actually be returned? As autumn settled over the coast, Frederick began strengthening his position without committing himself to a great battle. Christian forces worked around Jaffa, repairing its defenses and making the port a more useful base from which to threaten the approaches toward Jerusalem. Other troops improved positions near Sidon. Hammers striking stone could suggest preparation for war, even while the emperor's most important campaign continued in guarded tents and sealed letters. Frederick eventually moved south from Acre toward Jaffa, while al-Kamil shifted his camp from Nablus to Tal al-Ajul near Gaza. Between the two camps stretched roads crossed by merchants, scouts, servants, interpreters, and diplomatic parties. Envoys traveled back and forth, carrying proposals that could not yet be announced publicly. Secrecy was essential because both rulers understood that compromise would be attacked by people within their own communities. Frederick's request was simple in appearance, but complicated in detail. He wanted Jerusalem, together with access connecting the Holy City to the Christian-held coast. He also sought Bethlehem, Nazareth, and recognition of Christian possession in other territories. Al-Kamil, however, could not surrender Islamic sanctuaries or appear to abandon the religious legacy of Saladin. Jerusalem's defenses had been dismantled years earlier on the orders of al-Mu'azzam, who feared that a fortified city might fall to the Crusaders and become difficult to recover. Militarily, the exposed city was less valuable than its memory suggested. Spiritually, it was beyond ordinary calculation. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stood within the Haram al-Sharif, a sacred precinct whose surrender would be almost impossible to justify. Negotiators therefore began separating the city's neighborhoods, buildings, roads, and legal rights into carefully defined categories. While those discussions continued, another negotiation unfolded inside al-Kamil's camp. His brother al-Ashraf arrived in November 1228 to discuss the future of Damascus and the Ayyubid territories of Syria. The family was deciding how lands might be reassigned after al-Muazzam's death and how his young heir might be contained. Jerusalem thus became one piece in two diplomatic arrangements taking place at the same time. By reaching a truce with Frederick, al-Kamil could reduce pressure from the Crusaders and turn his attention toward Damascus. By obtaining Jerusalem, Frederick could claim that he had fulfilled his vow and returned to defend Sicily. Each man needed an agreement for reasons that extended far beyond the Holy City itself. The negotiations were neither smooth nor certain. Frederick reminded the Sultan that he had crossed the sea because of earlier assurances, and that returning without a visible achievement would damage his standing among the rulers of the West. Al-Kamil hesitated, balancing military practicality against the outrage that surrendering Jerusalem would cause. At times, the exchange resembled less a contest between civilizations than a difficult conversation between two rulers trapped by their own reputations. Each needed the other to provide a solution that could be presented as necessity rather than weakness. Neither possessed unlimited time. Reports reaching Frederick warned that papal forces had entered his Sicilian kingdom, while al-Kamil needed freedom to pursue his Syrian ambitions. The pressure was quiet, but it accumulated with every messenger arriving beneath the canvas awnings. By February 1229, the outlines of a settlement had taken shape. On February 18th, Frederick and al-Kamil accepted what became known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem would pass into Christian control, together with Bethlehem and a corridor linking the holy places to the coastal kingdom. Christian possession of Nazareth, Sidon, and other territories was recognized, while the ruined castle of Toron was also included in the settlement. But the Haram al-Sharif, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, would remain under Muslim religious administration. Muslims would retain access and the right to worship there, while Christian pilgrims would be permitted to visit the sacred precinct. Surrounding rural districts remained under Muslim authority, and the surviving accounts disagree over whether Frederick was allowed to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. The agreement established a truce lasting slightly more than 10 years and included provisions for prisoners and mutual restraint. Frederick promised not to support attacks against al-Kamil during the truce, a condition that troubled Christians who feared it could restrict future crusading efforts. The treaty's exact text has not survived, so its details must be reconstructed from Christian and Muslim accounts that sometimes contradict one another. Yet its central achievement is clear. Jerusalem, lost to Saladin in 1187, had been returned to Christian rule without a siege, without an assault on its streets, and without a major battle. The emperor had gained through parchment what far larger armies had failed to secure with swords. No victorious army poured through a broken gate. No towers burned against the night. Instead, seals were placed upon an agreement, instructions were sent to officials, and the holy places were divided by clauses whose meaning would soon be disputed. Frederick had achieved the objective that had defined crusading hopes for more than 40 years. But the silence surrounding the settlement was not the silence of universal relief. In Muslim cities, the loss of Jerusalem would be mourned as a humiliation. Among Christian leaders, the emperor's concessions and excommunicated status would make his success difficult to celebrate. When Frederick finally approached Jerusalem, he would discover that reclaiming the city was easier than persuading the world that he had won it. Part 3, a victory that no one could celebrate. In March 1229, Frederick began the journey from Jaffa toward Jerusalem. The road rose gradually away from the Mediterranean coast, passing through cultivated valleys, stony hills, and villages where news of the treaty had already begun to travel. His procession was not the triumphant host imagined in crusading sermons. There were no shattered enemy formations behind him, no captured banners displayed before cheering crowds, and no defeated sultan walking in chains. The emperor approached the holy city under the protection of a negotiated truce, accompanied by soldiers, officials, and uneasy allies who remained divided over whether his achievement should even be recognized. Somewhere ahead, Jerusalem waited without the defenses that had once made it a formidable prize. Its walls had been dismantled, its Christian population remained small, and its Muslim inhabitants were preparing to live beneath an arrangement that few of them had chosen. For Frederick, however, the moment carried immense symbolic power. Jerusalem had been lost to Saladin in 1187, and repeated expeditions had failed to recover it. Richard the Lionheart had come within sight of the city, but refused to attack because he doubted that his army could hold it. The Fourth Crusade had been diverted toward Constantinople, while the Fifth had collapsed in the floodwaters of Egypt. Now Frederick, weakened by excommunication and commanding a relatively modest force, had achieved what those campaigns could not. Yet he had done so by accepting limitations that earlier crusaders might have considered intolerable. The city had no secure Christian walls. The Temple Mount remained under Muslim administration. Muslim worship continued, and the surrounding countryside was not fully transferred to Frankish control. Jerusalem had been recovered, but not conquered. Frederick entered the city on March 17, 1229. Muslim officials withdrew temporarily to avoid confrontation, while the Qadi of Nablus, Shams al-Din, was charged with supervising the transfer and protecting Muslim interests. According to Muslim accounts, al-Kamil ordered that the Islamic call to prayer should not be heard during Frederick's visit, perhaps as a gesture of courtesy. But when the emperor noticed the silence, he reportedly asked why the muezzins had not called the faithful. He was told that the order had been given out of respect for him. Frederick answered that this was unnecessary, suggesting that he had not come to prevent Muslims from practicing their religion. Whether every word was preserved accurately is uncertain, Yet the story reflected something contemporaries found remarkable. The Christian ruler who had recovered Jerusalem appeared more curious about Islamic practice than eager to suppress it. Frederick visited the Haram al-Sharif, known to Christians as the Temple Mount. He entered the Dome of the Rock and inspected the sacred buildings that remained in Muslim hands under the treaty. His familiarity with Arabic culture and his willingness to speak openly with Muslim officials disturbed some observers. When he noticed a Christian priest attempting to enter the precinct carrying a gospel book, Frederick reportedly rebuked him and warned that unauthorized Christian behavior could endanger the agreement. To the emperor, preserving the treaty required discipline. To his critics, such restraint looked like excessive respect for Islam. Every gesture became evidence in a wider argument over whether Frederick had restored Christian honor or compromised it. The following morning, March 18, Frederick went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There was no patriarch waiting to crown him, no grand papal ceremony, and no unified assembly of crusader leaders celebrating the restoration of Jerusalem. Patriarch Gerald remained hostile, while the military orders continued to keep their distance. Frederick therefore approached the altar and placed a crown upon his own head. This action is often described as a self-coronation as King of Jerusalem, though its precise legal meaning remains debated. His infant son Conrad was the hereditary king through Isabella II, and Frederick claimed authority as the child's regent. Whatever title he intended to emphasize, the image was unforgettable. An excommunicated emperor standing within Christianity's holiest church, crowning himself in a city gained through an agreement condemned by many churchmen. Hermann von Salza, master of the Teutonic Knights, read a statement explaining Frederick's achievement and defending his conduct. The emperor had fulfilled his crusading vow, recovered the Holy City, and secured access to important Christian sites without sacrificing thousands of lives. Yet the ceremony remained strangely subdued. There were prayers, formal declarations, and the cold light of morning filtering through an ancient church, but no shared certainty about what had occurred. Soon afterward, ecclesiastical authorities placed Jerusalem under an interdict, restricting religious services in protest against Frederick's presence. The city that had supposedly been restored to Christendom entered its new Christian period beneath a cloud of religious censure. Muslim reactions were no less bitter. In Damascus, news that Jerusalem had been surrendered caused public mourning. Preachers condemned the treaty, and crowds grieved over the loss of a city associated with the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and with generations of Islamic devotion. Al-Kamil's political calculations were understandable within the rivalry of the Ayyubid family, but understanding did not make the transfer less painful. Muslim critics accused him of abandoning a sacred trust for temporary advantage. The Sultan defended the agreement by emphasizing that the Islamic sanctuaries remained under Muslim control and that Jerusalem's ruined defenses made the city difficult to protect. He could also argue that the truce was temporary. When it expired, circumstances might change again. Frederick did not remain long enough to transform Jerusalem into a secure capital. Without rebuilt walls, the city was exposed, and the corridor connecting it to the coast was narrow and difficult to defend. The emperor returned to Acre, where hostility against him had intensified. Patriarch Gerald denounced the treaty, while Templars and other opponents resisted imperial authority. Frederick suspected that some enemies might attempt to capture or kill him. The crusade that had avoided battle with al-Kamil now approached violence between Christians. Arguments spread through streets crowded with merchants, pilgrims, sailors, and armed retainers, each group hearing a different version of what the emperor had done. Time was pressing. Papal troops had invaded Frederick's possessions in southern Italy, forcing him to leave the Holy Land before his political position collapsed. On May 1, 1229, he departed from Acre. His final passage through the city revealed how deeply divided the Crusader community had become. As he moved toward the harbor, hostile residents threw refuse and animal entrails at him. The ruler who had recovered Jerusalem left beneath insults rather than hymns. He sailed west, carrying the knowledge that his most famous success had done little to reconcile him with the church or secure the loyalty of the kingdom he claimed to govern. After returning to Europe, Frederick defeated the papal forces occupying his lands and negotiated with Gregory IX. In 1230, the Treaty of San Germano ended their immediate conflict, and the emperor's excommunication was lifted. But disputes between Frederick and the papacy would return, becoming part of a much larger struggle over authority in medieval Europe. In the Crusader states, his attempt to impose imperial government helped provoke the War of the Lombards, a long conflict between Frederick's representatives and the Ibelin-led baronial opposition. Even after the emperor had departed, the political divisions he intensified continued to shape Cyprus and the Latin East. The peace in Jerusalem lasted longer than many contemporaries expected, but it was never permanent. The 10-year truce expired in 1239, and the city passed through further political changes. Christians briefly regained or extended control through later diplomacy, yet in 1244, Khwarezmian forces captured and devastated Jerusalem. The loss helped inspire the Seventh Crusade under Louis IX of France. Once again, armies gathered, ships crossed the Mediterranean, and Egypt became the target of a campaign meant to protect or recover the Holy Land. Frederick's diplomatic solution had postponed conflict, not ended it. And yet the Sixth Crusade remains one of the most unusual episodes in medieval history. It revealed that warfare and diplomacy were never as separate as later legends sometimes suggest. Frederick's small army gave weight to his negotiations, while al-Kamil's military strength allowed him to make concessions without having suffered defeat. Both rulers used sacred geography to solve immediate political problems. Neither abandoned faith, but neither allowed faith alone to determine policy. Jerusalem was reclaimed through a mixture of dynastic rivalry, legal claims, personal ambition, strategic weakness, cultural curiosity, and carefully exchanged words. As night settles over the imagined city, the final image is not a battlefield. It is Jerusalem beneath a quiet sky, its pale stones touched by moonlight, while Christian bells and the Muslim call to prayer belong to communities separated by law, yet gathered within the same sacred landscape. Somewhere beyond the walls, messengers carry copies of the agreement toward Cairo, Damascus, Acre, Rome, and Sicily. The Sixth Crusade recovered Jerusalem without a major battle, but it could not create agreement about what Jerusalem meant. Its victory was real, fragile, and deeply disputed, a triumph written on parchment, achieved without conquest, and remembered precisely because almost no one knew how to celebrate it.